I never imagined my sister, Sarah's wheelchair, would become a symbol of defiance, chained to our front porch by our power-mad Homeowners Association president. It was a blatant act of cruelty, and it all came to a head when an undercover FBI agent revealed that our seemingly quiet neighborhood, Willow Creek Estates, had been under surveillance for years. How far would you go when your family's freedom is literally locked away by the very people sworn to protect your community? Comment below with where you're watching from. The sound of metal grinding against concrete jolted me awake at 5:30 a.m. My heart pounded in my chest. Still in my pajamas, I raced to the front door, my bare feet slapping against the cold tile. What I saw made my stomach churn. Two men, sporting Willow Creek Estates HOA polo shirts, were wrapping a thick, industrial-grade chain around Sarah's wheelchair, securing it to our porch railing with a massive padlock. "Hey, what are you doing?" I yelled, rushing outside, my voice cracking with disbelief. "That's my sister's wheelchair." The taller man, his face devoid of emotion, handed me a piece of paper. "Mobility devices must be stored out of sight per HOA Bylaw 23.4. This is your third warning." Third warning? We'd never received a single notice. My mind reeled. Sarah had only moved in with me 3 months ago, after a horrific car accident had left her paralyzed from the waist down. "We never got any warnings," I protested, my voice rising in panic. "Ma'am, please take it up with the board," the second man said, curtly, his tone dismissive. They hurried to their golf cart, the electric motor whining as they sped away, leaving me standing there, barefoot and trembling with rage. I tugged at the chain, desperate to free the wheelchair, but it was useless. It was industrial-grade, unyielding. Sarah appeared in the doorway behind me, leaning heavily on her crutches she hadn't touched in weeks, thanks to the independence her wheelchair provided. "Rachel, what's happening?" Her voice shook, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah had worked tirelessly in physical therapy, pushing herself to regain her independence. Seeing her so vulnerable, so defeated, ignited a fire in my soul. "It's some kind of mistake," I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "I'll get this fixed, I promise." I frantically called a locksmith, but the earliest he could come was the afternoon. Panic clawed at my throat. Sarah had a job interview that day, a crucial step in rebuilding her life. "I have my interview today," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I can't miss it." I helped Sarah into my car, my hands shaking, and drove her to the interview. But the damage was done. Her confidence was shattered, the hard-won independence stripped away. While she was at the interview, I obsessively read through all 94 pages of our HOA guidelines. There it was, Bylaw 23.4, stating that mobility equipment must be stored inside or in designated areas. But the rule was clearly intended for things like bicycles and scooters, not essential medical equipment. This was a deliberate misinterpretation, a targeted attack. The locksmith finally arrived, charging me a staggering $175 for the emergency service. As he worked, my next-door neighbor, Diane, walked by, her 3 unauthorized garden gnomes somehow escaping the HOA's scrutiny. "Such a shame what Barbara's doing to you folks," Diane whispered, her voice laced with sympathy. Barbara Thompson, the HOA president?" I asked. Diane nodded grimly. "She doesn't like changes to the neighborhood aesthetic. The Millers had to move after their son got a service dog." That evening, I emailed the HOA board, explaining Sarah's disability and formally requesting an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. The response was swift and brutal. "Your request for exemption is denied. Additionally, the unauthorized wheelchair ramp at your front entrance Must be removed within 48 hours. Stunned, I stared at the email. The ramp? It had been approved by the city. I had permits. The next day, I called the city planning office, confirming my permits were in order. But when I returned home, a $500 fine was taped to my door, citing unauthorized modifications. I spotted Barbara Thompson herself, standing on the sidewalk, snapping pictures of our house. She was in her early 60s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, sporting an expensive-looking tennis outfit, despite never, to my knowledge, using the community courts. "Barbara," I approached her, trying to maintain a semblance of calm. "Can we talk about this? My sister Sarah has a disability and—" "Rules are rules," she cut me off, her voice like ice. "Your sister's condition doesn't entitle you to decrease property values for everyone else." "The wheelchair ramp is barely visible from the street," I explained, my voice trembling with suppressed anger. "And chaining down a wheelchair is not only cruel, but probably illegal." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps Willow Creek isn't the right community for your family's needs." As she turned to leave, I noticed she completely ignored the Petersons' holiday inflatables, still up from last Christmas, and Mr. Rivera's boat parked conspicuously in his driveway, both blatant HOA violations. That night, I stayed up late, researching disability laws. The HOA's actions were a clear violation of federal protections. I printed out the relevant statutes, determined to fight back. The next evening, I walked into the community center for the HOA meeting. The room fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes stared at me as I took a seat in the back. Barbara, of course, presided at the front table, flanked by 4 other board members. I raised my hand during the open comments section, but Barbara pointedly ignored me, time and again. Finally, I stood up. "I'd like to address the board about disability accommodations and the illegal chaining of medical equipment," I said, my voice loud and clear. Barbara's face flushed crimson. "That's not on tonight's agenda. Sit down, or you'll be removed." Surprisingly, my neighbor Kevin stood up. "I want to hear what Rachel has to say. My mother uses a wheelchair too." Reluctantly, Barbara granted me 3 minutes. I calmly explained Sarah's situation, distributing copies of the ADA requirements. Some neighbors nodded in agreement. "Furthermore," I concluded, "I've documented selective enforcement of HOA rules throughout our community with photographic evidence." I held up a folder brimming with pictures, showcasing numerous violations that went unpunished at specific homes. Barbara slammed her gavel. "Meeting adjourned." As people filed out, Kevin approached me. "Be careful," he whispered, his eyes darting around nervously. "Barbara has friends on the city council, but you're not alone in this fight." I drove home, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach, but also a flicker of determination. When I pulled into my driveway, my heart stopped. Yellow eviction notices were plastered all over my front door. They weren't even legal. They were fake HOA documents designed to intimidate. I tore them down before Sarah could see them, my hands shaking with fury. The next morning, the sound of drilling woke me. I ran outside to find 2 men installing a security camera on the light post directly across from my house. "What's going on?" I demanded. "HOA security upgrades," the installer replied, not even bothering to look at me. "All common areas are getting cameras." Except this camera wasn't pointed at any common area. It was aimed directly at my front door. This was blatant harassment. I called my friend Mia, a real estate lawyer. "They can't do this," she confirmed, her voice sharp with anger. "Document everything. Get a camera of your own." I installed a doorbell camera that afternoon. Within an hour, Barbara Thompson herself marched up to my porch and slipped another notice into my mailbox. My camera caught her smirking at my door. The notice was for another fine, $750 for making false accusations against the board. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Payment plans available if needed. We understand disabilities can be financially straining. That was the final straw. I created a private neighborhood Facebook group called Willow Creek Transparency and invited everyone except board members. By evening, 50 neighbors had joined. I shared my documentation of selective rule enforcement, complete with time-stamped photos. The comments poured in, a torrent of outrage and shared grievances. They fined me $300 for my daughter's basketball hoop, but ignored the identical one at the treasurer's house. Barbara's son parks his commercial truck at her house every weekend against HOA rules. They denied my request for a solar panel, but approved one for Barbara's friend. The next morning, someone slipped a large envelope under my door. Inside were financial documents showing that the HOA had paid $45,000 to a landscaping company owned by Barbara's brother for work that was never completed. A handwritten note was included. I'm on the budget committee. There's more. Be careful who you trust. I made copies and locked the originals in my safe. When Sarah left for physical therapy, I drove to the county records office. The property maps clearly showed that my wheelchair ramp was built entirely within my property line, not on common areas, as the HOA claimed. That afternoon, 3 board members, including Barbara, knocked on my door. We've come to offer a compromise, Barbara said, a tight smile plastered on her face. We'll allow temporary use of the wheelchair, provided it's covered with an approved neutral-colored tarp when outside. I remained calm. That's not a reasonable accommodation under federal law. Also, I'd like to discuss these financial records showing HOA funds paid to your brother's company. Barbara's face went pale. The other board members exchanged nervous glances. You're making a big mistake, Barbara hissed. I've been running this community for 15 years. People who challenge me don't last long here. After they left, I noticed a white van parked across the street. The same van was there the next day and the day after. Sarah was becoming increasingly anxious. Maybe we should just move, Rachel, she said, her voice filled with despair. I don't want to cause trouble. This isn't about trouble, I told her fiercely. This is about standing up to bullies. We have every right to be here. I contacted the local news station, Channel 7, and showed them my evidence of discrimination and potential financial misconduct. They were interested, but they needed more sources. Through the Facebook group, I connected with the Millers, who had moved away after the service dog issue. They agreed to be interviewed. 3 other former residents came forward with similar stories. The reporter discovered that Barbara Thompson had been sued twice before for HOA discrimination in other communities. The cases had been settled quietly, with non-disclosure agreements. I was preparing dinner when Kevin knocked on my back door. Don't react to what I'm about to tell you, he said quietly. I'm not just your neighbor. I'm with the FBI's white-collar crime division. We've been investigating Barbara and this HOA for months. My jaw dropped. What? Financial fraud? Across multiple HOAs, yes. But now we're adding civil rights violations, he said, handing me his card. We need your help to build our case. Can we count on you? Before I could answer, we heard glass shattering at the front of the house. We ran to find a brick had been thrown through Sarah's bedroom window. Attached was a note. Leave or worse. Kevin immediately called it in. This changes things, he said grimly. Now we've got criminal intimidation. As police officers took statements and collected evidence, Barbara drove by slowly in her luxury SUV, watching. Our eyes met, and she gave me a cold, chilling smile before driving away. I turned to Kevin. What exactly do you need me to do? Someone was knocking insistently on my door at 9:30 p.m. I peered cautiously through the blinds, my heart pounding in my chest to see my neighbor, Kevin, standing on my porch, his head on a swivel, constantly looking over his shoulder. The moment I cracked the door open, he pushed past me, his face etched with worry, without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk about Barbara and what she did to your sister's wheelchair," he whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of urgency and fear, "but not where anyone can overhear us." My stomach dropped. A wave of nausea washed over me. Did you help her do that to Sarah's chair?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, ready to shove him back out the door. Kevin shook his head vehemently. No, the opposite. I've been watching Barbara for months." He pulled out a worn leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming FBI badge. "I'm not really a retired accountant. I'm an undercover agent." I nearly collapsed into the nearest chair. "FBI for an HOA dispute? This is insane." "This goes way beyond wheelchair ramps and lawn ornaments, Rachel," Kevin said, lowering his voice even further. "Barbara Thompson has been running this scam in 3 different neighborhoods over the past 15 years. Kevin explained that after receiving dozens of complaints about discrimination, the FBI had launched an investigation into Barbara 6 months prior. She would infiltrate HOAs, systematically change the rules, and then use her power to force out families she deemed undesirable, families like mine and Sarah's. "But she also skims money off the top," Kevin continued, his voice tight with anger. "Those special assessments for the community pool repairs last year? Half that money went straight into her personal account. I remembered writing that $800 check, barely able to afford it, a sickening feeling churning in my gut. Are you serious? And nobody noticed? She replaces board members with her cronies. Anyone who questions her gets targeted with violations, harassed until they move away." Kevin pulled out his phone and showed me photos. Barbara, meeting with contractors behind the clubhouse, hushed conversations, furtive glances. She gets kickbacks from every vendor she forces the HOA to hire. "So all those contractor vans at her house," I started, piecing it together, "aren't just for her kitchen remodel. They're paying her to get exclusive HOA contracts," Kevin finished, his jaw clenched. My mind raced, replaying all the changes since Barbara became president 2 years ago. The landscaping company that inexplicably doubled our fees, the new unwanted security system, the special assessment for roof repairs that mysteriously only seemed to happen on her street. But then a question that burned in my mind surfaced. "But why chain my sister's wheelchair?" I asked, the image still vivid and painful. "That seems personal." Kevin's expression darkened. "Barbara targets anyone she perceives as lowering property values. She's been recorded using appalling language about people with disabilities. We have emails where she explicitly told the board, 'Your sister makes the neighborhood look like a hospital zone.'" My blood boiled. A wave of righteous fury washed over me. "That's disgusting. It's inhumane. It's also illegal," Kevin stated firmly. "The wheelchair incident provides us with concrete evidence of ADA violations, but we need more to build a comprehensive case regarding the financial crimes." He slid a small, sleek device across my table. "This is a specialized voice recorder. We need you to get her to admit to the wheelchair incident, and ideally, to talk about the HOA finances." I stared at the device, my palms sweating. "You want me to spy on her? You'd be helping us build a case that could help dozens of families she's victimized," Kevin explained, his voice earnest. "But I won't lie, it's not without risk. Barbara has friends in the local police department too." Just then, headlights swept across my living room window, illuminating the room for a split second. Kevin instantly ducked down, peering cautiously through the blinds. "That's her car," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Third time today, she's driven by your house." We watched in tense silence, as Barbara's luxury SUV crawled past, slowing dramatically in front of my home, the brake lights flaring red. Kevin waited until she had turned the corner before straightening up. "She's watching you," he warned, his voice grave. "Be extremely careful what you say and to whom. Some of the neighbors are informants. They report directly back to her." As Kevin prepared to leave, he paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "Think about it. If you want to help, text the word pool to the number I just put in your phone. If not, I understand." After he left, I sat in the darkened living room for a long time, the silence heavy and oppressive. From down the hall, I could hear Sarah struggling to transfer from her wheelchair to her bed, her movements strained, her grunts of effort piercing the quiet. Too proud to call out for help, the sounds of her quiet frustration solidified my decision. I picked up my phone and typed the single word, pool. Within seconds, a response came back. "Meeting tomorrow, playground, 3:00 p.m. I went to check on Sarah, but as I approached her room, I noticed something out of place outside her window. A small, flickering red light blinking intermittently in the bushes across the street. Someone was watching our house. The next day, I spotted Kevin sitting alone on a bench at the community playground, pretending to read a newspaper like a scene straight out of an old spy movie. As I approached, a mum with 2 young children walked past, and Kevin immediately and seamlessly transitioned into a loud, boisterous discussion about baseball scores. Once they were out of earshot, he handed me a seemingly innocuous coffee cup. "The recorder is inside," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Just press the bottom of the cup once to activate it." As we discussed the plan, I noticed the Henderson kids playing nearby. Their mother, Judy Henderson, was a prominent member of the HOA board and one of Barbara's closest confidants. "Don't look now," I murmured, "but we're being watched." Kevin nodded subtly, his eyes scanning the area. "That's why we're only talking about baseball. As far as anyone knows, we barely know each other." He explained that the FBI had uncovered evidence that Barbara was using HOA funds to pay for her daughter's college tuition and her husband's extravagant golf membership. They needed irrefutable evidence directly connecting her to these financial decisions, as well as the orchestrated harassment campaign against homeowners who dared to oppose her. "The meeting tonight is perfect," Kevin said, referring to the emergency HOA session Barbara had hastily called. "We know she's planning to announce another special assessment, supposedly for security camera upgrades, but the majority of that money will simply disappear." I frowned, my brow furrowing in confusion. How am I supposed to get her to admit to anything with the entire board present? "You're not," Kevin replied, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "You're going to publicly challenge her about Sarah's wheelchair. She'll get angry, flustered, and afterward, she'll almost certainly confront you privately. That's when you record her." As we finished talking, I saw Judy Henderson staring directly at us while feigning interest in her children's play. She immediately pulled out her phone and started texting furiously. "She's reporting to Barbara right now," Kevin said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Remember, as far as you know, I'm just a friendly neighbor." That evening, I arrived at the clubhouse for the HOA meeting, armed with the recording coffee cup and a folder overflowing with printouts detailing ADA regulations. Every seat was occupied, with many neighbors forced to stand along the walls, the largest turnout I'd ever seen. Barbara, predictably, sat at the front table, flanked by her 4 loyal board members, her usual fake smile firmly in place. "Before we get to the new security assessment," I called out, interrupting Barbara before she could even begin, "I'd like to address the illegal chaining of my disabled sister's wheelchair." The room fell deathly silent. Barbara's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. That matter was handled according to HOA bylaws, she said icily. Your personal grievances are not on tonight's agenda. I held up the heavy rusted chain that had been cruelly fastened to Sarah's wheelchair. This is discrimination against a person with disabilities. It violates federal law. Several neighbors gasped audibly. Barbara's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. Your sister's equipment was improperly stored, Barbara snapped, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. The board's decisions are final. We never voted on restraining a wheelchair, said Jack Wilson, a board member I barely knew, his voice surprisingly firm. When did we approve that? Barbara glared at Jack, her eyes blazing. We discussed this in private, Jack, like we discussed the $50,000 for the clubhouse renovation that never happened, I interjected loudly, my voice echoing through the stunned silence. The room erupted in a cacophony of confused questions and murmurs. Many neighbors looked shocked. They clearly hadn't known about the missing renovation funds. This meeting is about security cameras, not your baseless accusations, Barbara shouted, banging her gavel repeatedly, her face now a mask of fury. Security that we clearly need, with troublemakers like you in our community. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, I noticed Kevin at the back of the room, discreetly typing something on his phone. Our plan was working. Barbara was rapidly losing control. After Barbara abruptly ended the meeting, I lingered in the parking lot, pretending to search for my keys. Sure enough, Barbara stormed over to my car, her heels clicking angrily on the pavement. You've made a serious mistake, she hissed, jabbing her finger at my chest, her voice dripping with venom. Your little stunt tonight will cost you. I pressed the bottom of my coffee cup, activating the recorder. Are you threatening me, Barbara? I'm promising you consequences, she spat. Your sister's wheelchair was just the beginning. Keep pushing, and you'll find your car towed, your trees cut down for safety violations, and fines you can't possibly pay. Why are you doing this? I asked, trying to keep her talking, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. What did we ever do to you? Barbara stepped closer, her face inches from mine. People like your sister bring down property values. I've worked too hard, building this community to let people like you ruin it. The same way I got rid of the Gonzalez family and their noisy kids, and old Mrs. Wilkins with her ugly medical equipment on the porch. My hands shook with rage, but I kept the recorder running. And the money? For the clubhouse renovation? The new security system? She gave a small, smug smile. Managing an HOA isn't free. Consider it my compensation for keeping undesirables out. As she turned to walk away, she paused, turning back to me, a chilling glint in her eyes. I'd start packing if I were you. By this time next month, you won't be able to afford to live here anymore. I waited until she drove away before texting Kevin. Got it all. His reply came seconds later. Don't go home yet, wait 30 minutes. I sat in my car bewildered, wondering what he meant. Then I saw Barbara's SUV return to the clubhouse. She went inside with 2 board members carrying folders. Through the window, I could see them frantically removing papers from the filing cabinets, stuffing them into large bags. They were destroying evidence. I snapped photos with my phone, then ducked down as they returned to the parking lot. Once they left, I drove home the long way, making sure I wasn't followed. When I finally arrived, I found Sarah waiting up for me, her face etched with worry. How did it go? She asked anxiously. Before I could answer, we heard a loud thwack against our garage door. I rushed to the window, just in time to see Barbara's teenage son sprinting away. After spray painting "Leave Now" in large, angry letters across our garage. It went exactly as planned, I said grimly, sending the photos and a message to Kevin. They're scared. Sarah wheeled over and squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "What happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," I said, a steely determination hardening my voice. "We spring the trap." As we turned off the lights, I noticed a car slowly parking across the street, its headlights extinguished. Someone was watching our house. "Don't look," I whispered to Sarah. "But I think the FBI isn't the only one conducting surveillance tonight." Barbara's face turned ashen, whiter than a ghost, when she saw Kevin holding up his FBI badge, the gold glinting in the early morning sun. I'll never forget the look in her eyes, like a child caught red-handed stealing cookies, but magnified 1,000 times, the realization of impending doom washing over her. "Barbara Thompson," Kevin announced loudly, his voice resonating across the street, ensuring everyone within earshot could hear, "The FBI has been watching you and your HOA board for the past 8 months. People started emerging from their houses, drawn by the commotion. The Jacksons across the street, the elderly Fosters from next door, even the Petersons, paused their meticulous watering of their illegal garden gnomes to stare, their eyes wide with disbelief. This isn't what it looks like," Barbara stammered, her voice shaking, her carefully constructed composure crumbling before our eyes. She dropped her clipboard, the papers scattering across the neatly manicured lawn. "I'm just enforcing the rules." Everyone agreed to. Kevin shook his head, his expression unwavering. "Rules you changed without proper votes. Rules you only applied selectively to certain people. Rules that most significantly break federal disability laws." More FBI agents arrived in unmarked cars, their presence adding to the growing sense of gravity. One of the agents handed me back the chain they'd found in Barbara's garage, the very one used to cruelly imprison Sarah's wheelchair. They had irrefutable fingerprint evidence linking it directly to Barbara and her most loyal accomplice, board member Tom Wilson. "We have video evidence of you placing this chain," the agent told Barbara, his voice devoid of emotion. Her perfectly styled hair, usually so impeccably coiffed, seemed to deflate, mirroring her collapsing facade. Sarah rolled onto the porch, her movements strong and confident. "I've never been prouder of my sister. I thought I was the one with mobility issues," she said to Barbara, her voice clear and strong, ringing with defiance. "But you're the one who can't seem to move forward with the times." The news van from Channel 7 pulled up, its arrival perfectly timed. I'd called them the night before, after Kevin had given me the green light. Their reporter, Sandra Lee, rushed over, her cameraman in tow, microphone extended towards Barbara, who instinctively tried to shield her face. "Is it true the Willow Creek HOA has been targeting disabled residents?" Sandra asked, her voice sharp and probing. "No comment," Barbara shouted, attempting to push past the agents, her carefully cultivated image shattering into a million pieces. Kevin stepped forward, addressing the growing crowd of neighbors, his voice carrying authority and conviction. "We have substantial evidence that Mrs. Thompson and her board have embezzled over $350,000 from homeowner fees over the past 3 years." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The Andersons, whose children's treehouse had been forcibly taken down last summer, were recording everything on their phones, their faces alight with a mixture of shock and vindication. "That money was supposed to fix the community pool," shouted Mr. Foster, who himself used a walker, his voice trembling with outrage. "You said there wasn't enough in the budget." Barbara tried to make a dash for her car, but another agent swiftly blocked her path. "We have a warrant to search your home and the HOA office," he said, holding up the official documents, the paper crinkling in the sudden silence. I noticed Tom Wilson and 2 other board members attempting to discreetly slip away through backyards, their faces pale with panic. "Kevin," I pointed, my voice urgent. "The rest of her team is escaping." Agents quickly apprehended them, while others began systematically searching Barbara's house. Within minutes, they emerged carrying boxes, overflowing with documents, hard drives, and, most shockingly of all, a heavy safe containing stacks of cash and expensive jewelry, all purchased with our hard-earned money. "We found falsified ballots from the last 3 HOA elections," announced a female agent, her voice ringing with authority. "Barbara has been rigging votes to keep herself in power." The Petersons, who had always been staunch supporters of Barbara, looked utterly stunned, their faces a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. "She told us our Christmas decorations were approved because they added character to the neighborhood," Mrs. Peterson admitted, her voice shaking. "But she fined the Martinez family for their holiday lights." Kevin addressed the growing crowd, his voice calm but firm. "We believe Mrs. Thompson has been systematically targeting homeowners who challenged her authority or who she simply, personally disliked. She's been using selective enforcement as a weapon." My phone buzzed incessantly with text messages from neighbors I barely knew, all expressing shock, support, and a shared sense of relief. The community I thought had turned against Sarah and me was, in reality, filled with people who had been bullied into silence, afraid to speak out. An emergency community meeting was called that very evening at the clubhouse. Almost every resident from Willow Creek's 200 homes attended, the largest turnout in neighborhood history. People shared story after story of Barbara's tyranny, their voices trembling with years of pent-up frustration and anger. "She fined me for my daughter's basketball hoop, but ignored the Wilsons' identical one," said Mrs. Garcia, her voice rising with indignation. "She denied my request for a security light after my house was broken into, but approved her friend's backyard spotlight that shines directly into my bedroom," added Mr. Patel, his face flushed with anger. The FBI presented irrefutable evidence, detailing how Barbara had created a fake landscaping company that charged the HOA double the normal rates, with half the money funneled directly into her personal account. They showed bank records detailing her lavish vacation home in Florida, her luxury car, all paid for with our money. "How did you catch her?" someone in the crowd asked, their voice filled with awe. "It started with a wheelchair chain," I explained, holding up the heavy, rusted links, the metal cold against my skin. "She went too far when she targeted someone who couldn't defend themselves. But Sarah and I decided to fight back, with evidence, not anger." The crowd erupted in applause. I wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention, but it felt incredibly empowering to stand up, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had been silenced and victimized. By a resounding majority vote, a temporary board was established that night. To my surprise, they asked me to join. "We need someone who stands up for what's right," said Mrs. Foster, her voice filled with sincerity. 1 week later, Barbara Thompson, Tom Wilson, and 2 other board members were formally charged with multiple federal crimes: fraud, embezzlement, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. They faced years in prison and hefty fines. The HOA bank accounts were frozen, while forensic accountants meticulously traced every missing dollar. The new board discovered that Barbara had been skimming money for nearly 5 years, almost from the very day she became president. Our first official act as the new board was to pass a comprehensive accessibility policy, with Sarah serving as the lead consultant. All outstanding violation notices were immediately suspended, while we rewrote the bylaws to be fair, equitable, and transparent. "This isn't about getting revenge," I told the newspaper reporter who covered our story, her pen scribbling furiously in her notebook. "It's about making sure everybody feels welcome in their own neighborhood." 2 months later, the community gathered for a joyous block party, the first in Willow Creek's history. People who had lived next door to each other for years, but had been kept apart by fear and intimidation, were finally becoming friends. Children played freely on lawns without the constant threat of arbitrary violation notices. The Martinez family's son, who, like Sarah, used a walker, enthusiastically demonstrated the new accessible playground equipment we'd installed with the recovered funds. As Sarah and I watched our neighbors laughing, sharing food, and connecting with one another, she squeezed my hand, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "Thank you for not giving up," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Some chains you can see," I replied, my voice catching in my throat. "And some you can't. We broke both kinds." The infamous wheelchair chain now hangs prominently in our community center, a powerful symbol of our collective struggle and triumph. A small plaque beneath it reads, "Freedom sometimes requires courage, community, and occasionally the FBI." Barbara's house stands empty, awaiting sale, a stark reminder of the past. Sometimes I catch neighbors glancing at it as they walk by, still processing how one person could wield so much control over their lives. But mostly, people are looking forward, not back. Yesterday, Sarah rolled smoothly and effortlessly up the gentle slope of our new community-wide accessible pathways, racing the neighborhood kids on their bikes. No chains, no barriers, no fear. She smiled at me, a radiant, genuine smile, and said something I'll never forget. "The best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting better." This story highlights the importance of standing up for what's right, even when facing seemingly insurmountable odds. It demonstrates that one person's courage, combined with community support and a commitment to justice, can overcome even the most entrenched systems of power and abuse. It also serves as a powerful reminder that true community is built on inclusivity, respect, and a willingness to fight for the rights of all its members. Have you ever experienced a similar situation in your community? Share your stories and thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of courage and resilience.